My name is Joel Stanley. I am one of the founders of Charlotte's Web, and I currently serve as chairman of the board there. It is my pleasure to introduce to you to Dr. Karyemaître Aliffe. Dr. Aliffe knows quite a bit about this stuff, actually. I was just listening to his earlier talk today where I think he's going to, about to dive into how cannabinoids, how this plant interacts with our bodies. And he really has a way of talking about these things that help some of the lay people understand. And so without further ado, I hope you enjoy Dr. Aliffe.
Well, good afternoon. Hope you guys had a good lunch. Feel free to fall asleep. All right. If you do fall asleep, just blame it on the terpenes in your food or something like that. So this next part, as Joel was saying, a way of understanding cannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system, what I'd like to do is present to you a potential niche market opportunity that, to my knowledge, hasn't really been given much discussion or publicity. And I'll just go straight for it. I usually don't quote people, but this to me is hilarious. And especially if you're used to being around people that feel like they know a lot, you know, university people, academic, intellectual people, they always have everything clear. They always know exactly what to do until they get hit in the mouth. Sometimes you get hit in the mouth by the data, by the reality of something, and people try to fight back with dogma, and sometimes it's better to just, you know, go down for a 10 count and get up and regroup. And cannabis is hitting a lot of people's dogma in the mouth, but here I'm talking about it literally. So we have this aspect in our society that celebrates to a greater or lesser degree physical violence, pain, and suffering as sport. And without getting into any sort of philosophical should or should not of that, this past July, as you can see on this slide, I was speaking to the Association of Boxing Commissions, like the World Boxing Federation, boxing and combative sports and all that sort of thing, because they're concerned about their sport, and specifically I was there to talk about traumatic brain injury. And as I mentioned to them, that combative sports, it's an interesting sport to talk about brain injury because basically it is the sport where you have usually two people in a small space, and the goal is for one to inflict traumatic brain injury on the other one before the other one does it to them. And for some reason they hadn't looked at it that way. I was surprised as anybody. So, but my approach was that, look, this is obviously a big cultural icon, and so as long as it exists, as long as people are wanting to do it, we should do it as wisely as possible. And that means protecting the boxers and therefore protect boxing. And I mentioned here that the boxers need to remain mentally sharp and healthy to perform. And the main reason for mentioning that is because people associate cannabis, of course, as we were saying earlier, with just the opposite of that, with mental dullness and irresponsibility, that sort of thing. But the science really shows that high-quality hemp CBD oil can be a clear and present solution for this circumstance of traumatic brain injury and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So the question is, do we have a plan, especially after getting hit in the mouth? So here, just to run through the current sort of news, 2017, 2018, the record of the NFL with traumatic brain injury, TBI, and the further pathologic extension of TBI, which is CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that has actually led to a decrease in the number of parents who want their kids to play football as high school kids or even younger, and also, I guess, among the kids themselves. So there's been a big drop-off in the number of kids playing Little League football and high school football. And there's this article, again, going back to the Journal of American Medical Association. To me, that's kind of like the, USA Today or whatever of journals that lets you know what the mainstream pharmaceutical practice of medicine, what they're thinking about and how they think about things. And so it mentions that traumatic brain injury is having a detrimental effect on the sport of high school football, tackle football, and they have a few data points in here, and it mentions how many fewer football players that there are. 184,133 fewer football players than if that upward trend that had previously been occurring had continued. That's a lot. That's a lot of difference in the number of children, a number of humans participating in the sport. And of course, you don't get professional football players unless you have high school football players. And so they estimated that there have been somewhere between 6,700 and 14,000 fewer concussions attributed to participation in high school football. I didn't realize there were so many. I mean, I never played football. I played soccer as a kid. My father had played football and coached football, and I knew that there were a lot of people on the field bigger than me, and I didn't think that made sense. If I was the biggest person, like Shaq or somebody like that, maybe I would have played football, but to have somebody out there looking forward to hurting me, just even at age 15, just didn't really click for me. So what I have this slide on here for is this Dr. Paul Echlin, who's a sports medicine doc. It's pretty unusual for a sports medicine doctor to come out so strongly against sports, because usually sports medicine docs are orthopedic surgeons typically, or just very much into sports and athletics, and so they support it to the very end. And he is quoted in here as saying, "No child should ethically be allowed to participate in tackle football." That's a big, huge shot across the bow. And as I was telling the boxing people, I don't think that boxing could survive statements like that, because boxing is not a team sport. People tend to support these team sports, their home, high school, college, professional team, that sort of thing. Boxing doesn't have that same sort of following. Excuse me. So again, just to kind of look at the numbers, this is self-reported concussion among college athletes, not just in football, but across the board. And what percentage had a concussion at least once and then multiple concussions. So you see how common it is. 10% for women, 13.3% for men. And then they looked across the Division 1, 2, and 3 levels of sports, pretty much consistent. But 10%, 1 in 10 people, that's a lot. It starts to sound less like sport, like people that are just going out to have fun, and something else. I'm not even sure what word to attribute that. As you go through the different sports, then 20% of women playing ice hockey, 15% with field hockey, 20% of men wrestling, 18% football, 19% with ice hockey, to have had at least one concussion at some time in their college career. So this is a big deal to me. And even in the Ivy League, where maybe it might seem like, sports aren't that intense, even though they are, and as someone reminded me in the audience, the Harvard-Yale game is coming up. So they try to make things a little bit softer, and in the NFL they've tried to do that as well by adjusting the rules and identifying circumstances in which there's more head injury. So people are trying to work with this, and obviously they're feeling a bit threatened because the NFL and the Ivy League aren't really just the sort of group that you can go and petition and get them to change their rules and tell people to stop tackling with their head and that sort of thing. So here's the issue with TBI, CTE. TBI is going to occur in any of the heavy contact sports. And so how can we protect athletes, children and adults, from TBI and CTE? And these are progressive conditions comprised of discrete insults and insidious deterioration. They don't just happen on the day of diagnosis. And in our culture, we have this tendency to think that everybody is perfectly healthy until they come home from the doctor with some sort of a diagnosis, the sort of thing where, oh my God, Shirley went to the doctor yesterday and she has cancer. And emotionally, socially, psychologically, we don't like to deal with the fact that, say, someone with a breast cancer diagnosis, it means they've had cancer for 15 or 20 years. From a cancer biology perspective, those cells have been in there growing, and it just took that long before the doctor could detect it, or if the person doing self-examination could detect it, before it becomes clinical cancer. So it's kind of like people that, decide that, oh, well, I just turned 60, I think I should stop doing this or back off on that, as though the day before when they were 59, it was some difference. So that's kind of this social, cultural way of thinking that actually doesn't work the way the human body works, the way the physiology and biology of it work. But keep in mind that every time an athlete, a warrior, is knocked out, has their bell rung, or gets clocked, they have suffered some degree of mild to severe traumatic brain injury. And this article here from 2013 is interesting in the part that I highlighted here in the introduction, where it says a cognitive deficit can be observed in mild traumatic brain injury participants even 1 year after injury. So myself, for instance, I played soccer in high school, and I was the captain of the team and did well on the state level, like All-State or something like that. And so the summer after my freshman year in college, I was invited to be an assistant coach at one of the soccer camps in Michigan. And there were a couple of guest professional soccer players that were playing there. Way back then, soccer was just getting started in the U.S. as a professional sport. And this guy, I still remember his name, Wayne Pierman, he had an amazing penalty shot where he could be out, 40 yards and just drill the ball at the goal accurately and kick the ball hard enough really that, like, if he kicked it at your living room window or maybe even your car window, it would shatter. And so here we are, 18, 19-year-old kids, and he's out there doing his penalty kicks, and we decide that we can stop him. And so a couple of the guys who were the high school kids and myself as one of the assistant coaches, we're standing in the goal. You've probably seen in soccer where they take penalty kicks and the guys always duck, so we decide not to duck. So here comes this ball going about 80, 90 miles an hour at us, and since we're not goalies, we can't use our hands, so we're using our head to stop this ball. Bam, bam, and very proud of ourselves every time we hit this ball out and he's not able to score. And one of the kids on our team had suffered a couple of concussions in high school just playing around and doing crazy things and falling down the stairs and skiing and stuff like that. And when he did it, he almost lost consciousness. And we were like, Frank, what, you have another concussion? Because this wasn't news way back then when I was in high school. And yeah, probably he was suffering another concussion, and he had additional susceptibility because of these multiple injuries. But the reason I mention it is you're not really going to be able to stop a bunch of teenage guys or kids even from doing stuff like that. It's just going to happen. And I don't want to stop people from doing that. I mean, maybe I lost, 0.5 in my GPA. I could have been Phi Beta Kappa or something, and I headed too many soccer balls, and so I didn't make valedictorian or whatever. But those should be personal choices, because not everybody needs to be valedictorian, as Bill Gates is a great example. So what do we do, though, to help people that are at risk? What can we do to actually optimize their future? Because mild traumatic brain injury doesn't receive very serious attention from physicians. And as I mentioned earlier, like vague complaints from women with fibromyalgia, and it's like, oh, here comes some woman complaining, oh my, that sort of thing. That's a very kind of patronizing attitude is very common in medicine. And it also happens to be the case for mild traumatic brain injury. And so it's looked at as being a no-brainer. It's looked at as being something that's not interesting. Mild traumatic brain injuries usually require no treatment other than rest and over-the-counter pain relievers to treat a headache. And I saw this, and this is from Mayo Clinic. I thought it was very interesting because at some level they are responsible, liable, I guess, because they're a medical center and they're giving basically medical advice, and that the person usually needs to be monitored closely at home for any persistent worsening or new symptoms. That's putting a lot of responsibility on mom and dad or partner, spouse, person, that if this person just suddenly, and they start to herniate because they've got brain swelling, well, you might not notice that. You might have on your VR goggles and be playing Destroy the World games and things and not notice it. So, this is from Maastricht University in Holland, and this is a little excerpt out of a 148-page research document. It's a doctoral thesis, just so you can see the attitude that people have that you would think are scientists and dispassionate physicians. Mild traumatic brain injury is considered a benign and trivial neurologic condition, resulting in apparently uneventful recovery. Now, just imagine somebody going into the emergency room with a complaint associated with TBI, and people with this sort of attitude are attending to them. You're probably not getting their attention so much. They're looking for something a bit more severe and dramatic. And so they mention in here that clinicians in the field often encounter this significant group of patients, also referred to as the miserable minority. So obviously they're really not taking this seriously, even though, as I showed you in the other paper, it can be shown that there are cognitive deficits as much as 1 year out from mild traumatic brain injury. So the doctors don't have a plan, or at least they're still working on it. So we need to have a plan. Traumatic brain injury is going to occur, and CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is an occult nemesis that's out there waiting. And in some of these cases, it's very, very tragic. I'll show you one quickly from my own home state, Washington, where I live now. A football player by the name of Tyler Helinski, who was set to be big star in the, Pac-10 conference, NCAA football. He was going to be the starting quarterback. He won a big game against their rival, Boise State, last year, I guess around this time last year. And 21-year-old guy, and he was not the starting quarterback. He was the backup quarterback, and he was about to go into his senior year. This year would have been his senior year, so that was his junior year. So, young guy. And he had won this game, and everybody's happy because they beat the crosstown rival. Not crosstown, but Boise. It's pretty close, I guess. And he committed suicide in January. And the family was wondering why, because here's this happy guy, super accomplished, everything to look forward to. He's finally going to get his starting position on the football team. And they find out that at age 21 that he had stage 1, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And I picked this picture because, to me, it's very poignant. This is just a snapshot from an internet page, which many of these are, and I encourage you to, if some of these things interest you, to know that it's immediately accessible. It's not in some secret doctor, deep, dark web site or something. This is just regular stuff. And so from June of this year, on the one side, you see this picture of Tyler Helinski and a still of a video, and then there's advertising over here that ironically is a child, a young girl, who's wearing a band around her head that says that it's a head guard, which it doesn't strike me as something that would really give much protection, depending on what she ran into and how hard, of course. It would protect the skin, but it wouldn't protect the brain, because the brain is inside of the skull bouncing around. That's what causes the TBI. But anyway, with people like that committing suicide, how many people like her are going to want to go on with these sports? So it's a big issue, because so many colleges, depend on their college sports, their big football sports, and they make a lot of money, and the coaches make more money than the professors do. And they find out, they requested an autopsy, and they find out that he had chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And as they mentioned here in the article, that he had the brain of a 65-year-old. Now, if any of you in here are 65 years old or over, please don't take offense. It's just a way of speaking. He had a brain of a 65-year-old with signs of extensive brain damage known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which has been found in hundreds of former NFL players. But this guy never made it to the NFL. He wasn't even somebody who had played 2 or 3 years of college football. He had played 3 or 4 years of high school football and Little League football before that, and his younger brother and older brother were both quarterbacks. But he shot himself in the head because of this CTE, because it causes these neurobehavioral changes, personality changes. This is a shocking and a horrible situation. And is there anything that could possibly help? In this case here, this is about a boxer named Daniel Franco who almost died because he had already suffered subclinical TBI from a knockout. I think it was in New Mexico, and he had a bout maybe 6 weeks later in Iowa. Maybe it was here in California, I think. And anyway, there's no rule that says that a fighter who gets knocked out has to have a CT scan or any other kind of brain scan. And so they found, when he went to the emergency room in the fight where he got knocked out again, that he had these small fractures in his skull, and having gotten hit in this fight exacerbated everything, made the whole thing worse, created a bleed, and they had to put him in deliberate coma, what's called a barbiturate coma, for a prolonged period of time just to get him through. They weren't really sure he was going to survive. So chronic traumatic brain injury associated with boxing, it occurs in approximately 20% of boxers. And as it says here, the mainstay of treatment is prevention. But of course, as long as we have this in our culture of things like boxing and football and hockey and all of these sports, especially where we encourage boys to be aggressive and physical and that sort of a thing, what could we offer from the hemp industry? And I believe that hemp is a healing opportunity for sustainability in sports. And as this article says, that it's basically a no-brainer about CBD and THC for head injuries. And it's well known among football players and other pro athletes, but of course there's the government regulation kind of standing in the way. But to quickly highlight, the government has had a patent for quite a long time identifying cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants, that CBD and THC can limit neurological damage following ischemic insults such as stroke or trauma. And what that's saying is, because in those cases, in the case of stroke or traumatic brain injury, the problem is that blood flow to the brain becomes compromised, and the brain uses up a lot of energy, uses up a lot of oxygen, needs a lot of blood flow to deliver glucose, that sort of thing, because those nerve cells are constantly firing and constantly working. Some people may not seem like they're not so brain active, but all of us are. So that's true. Just because they're in the government doesn't mean that their brain isn't working. So a 2014 study found that traumatic brain injury patients who tested positive for THC were more likely to survive with less impairment than the TBI patients who had abstained from marijuana and therefore had no THC on board. And so that they also found that CBD is highly active against brain ischemia, meaning decreased blood flow to the brain, and that it modulates many of the molecular hallmarks of the pathology associated with TBI. And it also has some other effects with heart arrhythmias and these other things that are mentioned here, but specifically and correctly, they mention that CBD produces no intoxicating effects, no THC-like high, and it does not lead to tolerance, but there's still no FDA-approved clinical trials looking at this. But because we have hemp CBD products, you don't really need to wait for the clinical trials because, again, as I said, you know, first do no harm. And if you have a well-made product that is safe, it's safe enough for a little girl to take who has epilepsy, it's safe enough for any of us to take on a daily basis, then it's safe enough for someone to take. Meanwhile, you don't have to wait 10 or 15 years until the clinical trial data comes through, because by that point, you know, a 5-year-old kid who's starting out in Little League football is now 20 years old. They could have been taking it every day. So what is this endocannabinoid system? There's no way to describe it in a few words, but it's often referred to as the biological harm reduction system. And it was actually discovered because of marijuana use, because of cannabis research. It's been in the body forever and ever. It's supposedly 600 million years old, the endocannabinoid system. And its complex network holds dominant control over brain and body functions, but it's specifically cognitive functions, learning, memory, personal change, emotions, moods, fear, anxiety, feelings of failure. For those of you who were here earlier when I was talking about Tylenol, you can recognize many of these from the category of Tylenol's activity as a CB1 drug, meaning a drug that works like THC. It also affects our appetites for food, sexual interaction, reproduction, pain perception, and modulation. So here's something, perhaps a little tidbit about the endocannabinoid system. What's going on? How is it that, say, a boxer who's in the ring and they get hit really hard, why don't they just kind of cry and run away like many of the rest of us would do, like I would do? Okay, I would get out of the ring and run as far as I can. If somebody's trying to hit me and cause traumatic brain injury, that's not a place I want to hang out very long. We have the ability to modulate intentionally how our body responds to stresses, how our body responds to the environment, okay? So that guy who's in the ring and his mom and dad are in the audience, maybe his dad is his coach in the corner, he's very proud of himself that he got hit that hard and he didn't go down. So he's sending a completely different set of instructions to that endocannabinoid system about what to do, what should happen. And that might sound like, oh, mind-body stuff. Well, it is, right? Because there's a difference between, you know, the classic thing, the mother defending her child. There's a difference between what a person is willing to go through if it's just, you know, final exam season or taxes are due tomorrow, and if they're trying to run for their lives carrying their infant because there's a tsunami coming. Okay, it's just different physiology, biology occurring. And how is that modulated? It's a different set of choices. It's a different set of conditions or instructions. The endocannabinoid system is an operating system, okay, for the body. Just like the Apple iOS, this is the EOS, the endocannabinoid operating system. Just like Apple computers and Microsoft and all these people with Windows and those operating systems that created this whole digital revolution, hemp, cannabis are like apps in our endocannabinoid system. You think that the world changed a lot because of computers and smart devices and phones and all that? Wait till you see these next 10 years with hemp, with CBD and THC, because eventually this THC part's going to fall away, because it's really, there's a difference between somebody using cannabis to get high and somebody using cannabis therapeutically, whether it's CBD dominant or not. In fact, there's a study from Harvard that showed, it came out, I guess, it was within the last 8 months, I believe, that, and it's, the title says something like, the grass is greener. They like to make these puns. But they showed that adults, some of them older adults, using medical marijuana actually had improvements in cognitive function and executive functions of the brain as compared to recreational marijuana users. So it's not just about the plant. Like I was saying, it's not the plant's fault. It really has to do with how it's being used and perhaps even the intent behind it, and also the dosages. One of the talks that I give that, again, there's not time for today, is about microdosing. And it has to do with how different it is to give very small doses, frequent doses, daily, maybe even twice a day, of cannabinoids, of CBD. When you're at these low doses, the doses are too low with respect to the THC for anyone to get high, and the CBD modulates the THC effect, and also, of course, it has its own effects. Basically, when you compare hemp to marijuana, sure, the regulatory distinction is 0.3%, but the pharmacologic distinction is that fundamentally, hemp is microdose cannabis. It's that cannabis that is not going to get you high, but it's doing all that work. I mention this and I underscore this because I know lots of manufacturers are confronted with the polemic of full spectrum products versus isolates. And what's the difference? There's a big difference sending CBD into the body by itself without its buddy, THC. It's a different spectrum, okay? I'll just say it in very simple terms like that rather than trying to go into the details. They work together. That small amount of THC that's in the tinctures and the topicals and all that sort of thing is still there, and it's still helping. And everybody who's getting hit in the mouth needs to have a CBD plan, ideally a full spectrum CBD plan. This guy did, Nate Diaz, and he was actually honest enough, bold enough, if you will, to do an interview. He's a very famous UFC fighter, apparently, and he was doing an interview after a fight. I mean, look at his face after this fight, and this guy is smoking a vape pen that's a CBD pen. Of course, they call it, he was vaping marijuana, so they're making it sound like he's there getting high. He's doing an interview. He's not getting doped out, but it's just that emotional, cultural reaction. And so they ended up, you know, harassing him at the very least, arresting him, whatever, I'm not sure. But he actually went on record as saying, yes, that he uses that to help manage himself. And of course, you know, CBD has other effects, the anti-inflammatory, pain management, all these sorts of things. And so one of the things that I mentioned to the World Boxing Federation people is really that these people should be getting, you know, how they always in the movies have the boxers get the rub down after the fight and all that. And I said, well, you know, give them, you know, CBD-rich massage oil, hemp oil, and rub them down with that. At least you're getting this CBD on board. And as the research shows, it can be given up to 6 hours after the traumatic brain insult and still have its effect, still have the protective effect. 6 hours later, that's impressive. What's the issue that occurs with traumatic brain injury, and how do these cannabinoids help, both CBD and THC? Again, a way of thinking about it is even just, you know, what happens when that boxer or football player or whoever has that critical moment and gets knocked out. Their legs buckle, they fall down. Why? It's protective. That's a self-defense of the body that's just been stressed beyond its limits, okay? The brain has been stressed Now its blood supply is being compromised. You want to optimize blood supply to the brain. How do you optimize blood supply to the brain? You lay down. It's a lot of work for the heart to get blood from here up to here. And it's a lot easier when this person goes like that. Now it's not working against gravity anymore. So all of these little things that just might seem very common are intricate technologies within the physiology and the human body. And, well, what more? With THC, people tend, as I mentioned earlier, with the Tylenol, they don't get as caught up emotionally in things that are good or bad. They're not as concerned about social rejection and failure, all those sorts of things. Well, does that make sense? Is there a harm reduction component there? Yes, because after waking up from being knocked out, and often with concussions people aren't knocked out, the last thing the person needs to do is have an argument. The last thing that person needs to do is stay up all night studying and trying to calculate pi out to 40 digits or some sort of thing, or to do their taxes, or to drive all night from LA to San Diego or to Portland or someplace like that, because all of those behaviors require additional brain activity. Additional brain activity requires additional energy, additional nutrients from the circulation. The neurons that have been compromised, if they're running at that high rate, they burn out. So the benefit of this cannabis and even the stupor that people might associate with getting high is because you want to be kind of like they put that boxer in a coma, in like this semi-comatose state where nothing is bothering you. It's kind of like putting a cast on your leg, and you can no longer go like this, or your arm, you can no longer go like that, so it has a chance to heal. The swelling goes down, or the fracture might have a chance to heal. It's the same thing here. It's like putting a big cast around the person's brain, around their mind. It's not going to be so active as a regular person who hasn't been injured. That is part of the harm reduction. That's happening at a behavioral level, as I mentioned. It's also happening at a neurophysiologic level. And so just like, as I said, that person wouldn't want to have an argument externally, they also don't want to have an argument internally. So if you imagine, like, this is a neuron, and this is another neuron, and this neuron is saying, hey, how come you haven't washed the dishes? Obviously, it's a dramatization. This neuron is like, dude, don't bother me. I just got my head torn off in the ring, didn't you see? And so it's like, okay, shut up, and it puts in these earplugs. So functionally, this neuron is no longer being harassed by this neuron that's trying to make it feel bad for losing the fight, for having a messy apartment and being, late with paying taxes or something like that. It's just like, look, we want to live through the day, and we want to optimize our neurologic survival, so you need to chill, okay? So this is called retrograde transmission, because the information from the endocannabinoid system is going backwards. Usually the information's coming in this way, and this neuron is saying, take it easy, I'll talk to you next week, okay? So that's part of the harm reduction as well. And that's mediated both by THC and CBD. And it also extends beyond the usual CB1 and CB2 receptors. Part of what happens in the brain when it gets shaken around is that there are these little micro tears and interruptions and debris. So the brain is kind of like any other part of the body. The rest of the body gets filtered and cleaned out by the blood, and the blood gets cleaned out by the liver and the kidneys and filtered, kind of like dialysis, which is an imitation, of course, of the kidneys. Well, the brain has to do that too. Our archaic sense of the brain as this pristine sort of chapel or castle that is impervious to the outside world is really not true. And so when you start to shake this around, some of these little micro channels that usually are flushing the brain of, kind of like when you work out and the whole thing, tannic acid and all that, and muscle cramps and that sort of thing. It needs to wash out these metabolites that if they build up, they become toxic. But if you mess up those channels, it gets blocked. And if you mess up those channels and they don't get fixed, then it stays blocked for the rest of your life, perhaps. So you can start to see or comprehend at least figuratively, the pathophysiology of a progression from a mild traumatic brain injury to this chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And am I 20 minutes overtime or just 10 minutes overtime? I have no idea. 10? Okay. So here you can see in this slide, just really quickly, this is like the vasculature in the brain, and there's a lot of stuff in there that looks familiar to medical people and looks like Star Trek to everybody else, but it just shows that this brain is constantly flowing with fluids, and that's how it's very easy for the cannabinoids to get in there and do their job. There's this constant exchange that's going on, and when that gets blocked off, then there's a buildup of waste in the brain. Kind of like what happens, if you stay up too late watching the news on CNN or something, and there's just more and more trash building up in your brain, and there's no place to dispose of it, and you start thinking crazy things just because of what they're saying. That's a joke. Maybe not. So how does harm reduction work in the ECS? So these cannabinoids, not limited to THC and CBD, that's what we've limited ourselves to looking at. Remember, pharmacology primarily is driven by pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceuticals are single drugs. They're not botanicals, they're not natural products, they are patented single drugs that are a protected industry in order to make money. They could never make money out in the open market. You take a pharmaceutical company like Pfizer and you say, well, why don't you run Starbucks or McDonald's? They could never do it. They have to eliminate the competition. They have to have 25 years where they can sell their burgers and fries for like $50, and they know that those burgers are going to be recommended by doctors all around the world, and that's their blockbuster drug. But if they had to deal with somebody on, selling burgers at the corner of, 6th and Madison or something in New York, and they're just selling them for $2.95, they can't compete in an open market, in a flat marketplace. Pharmaceutical company cannot compete. That's what makes the cannabis and especially the hemp industry so dangerous, because you can't really control it, and you can't control the narrative because it's not coming from New Jersey or from Holland or from Bayer or from Pfizer or Merck. It's coming from all of us, and so it's very difficult to control that sort of narrative, and especially it works. It's not just some botanical that people aren't sure about. Everybody knows that it works. 80, 90% of us, if we have never experienced cannabis, we've at least experienced someone experiencing it. We know that it works. It's not one of those questions like, oh, here's cat's claw, it comes from the rainforest, and the traditional healers use it. It's like, oh, really? Yeah, well, I don't think so. It's not one of those botanicals. It's ours. So when THC and CBD are taken in a balanced combination, as in full spectrum hemp CBD oil, there's a clear synergy in their effect. And here's the part that I was mentioning. It's been shown that giving cannabidiol up to 6 hours following a cerebrovascular compromise event, that's a great phrase. It sounds like parties in a tent and open bar. It's not. A cerebrovascular compromise event is just, TBI, a stroke, something that causes the blood flow to the brain to be compromised. It can even be caused by severe dehydration. So there are lots of different conditions that can lead to that. But even 6 hours after the event itself, cannabidiol can still have a significant effect on limiting the amount of damage that occurs to nerve tissue, to neurons, to brain tissue, and reducing the amount of inflammation. And here's an interesting thing, at least to, like I said, geeky people that stay up all night reading this stuff. One of the current growing understandings, this whole space, why is it so arcane? Why are there so many issues around hemp and cannabinoids? Because we haven't really dealt with the mind, body, emotional, spiritual, human part of a person. And this is all over that space, okay? And so one of the things that's being found is that there's not so much difference between anxiety and depression and stress and PTSD, and that there's a huge inflammatory component, okay? So inflammation is like I said, like the swelling that a person gets when they, sprain their wrist or their ankle. It's also like the swelling that can occur with an infection, those sorts of things. The immune system is fighting something. Often, though, it's fighting nothing, okay? Just like as humans, we often fight each other for no reason, and it just creates collateral damage, okay? So that's what's going on with inflammation. So being able to back off from the inflammation or to be able to mitigate that inflammation is great. So not only for TBI and its progression to CTE, but even everyday things like stress, anxiety, depression, and pain. So this is like the amazing thing. This is like the amazing missing nutrient in the human diet. If we could just dump it in everybody's water supply, maybe everybody would, be dancing and singing, what is that song they always sing? Yeah, that's it. Poor Kumbaya. It's a great song, and they just slam it all the time. Anyway, but if we had our endocannabinoid system toned up with some beautiful hemp CBD oil, we'd be belting out Kumbaya. We'd probably have a little backbeat going and everything. It changes people. See, this is the problem. It changes people. Like I told you, I trained in anesthesia. Whoever you think you are, you don't know the other side. You haven't seen the person that the anesthesiologist saw. You haven't seen the person, heaven forbid that any of you would ever end up there, but maybe a family member or something. A classic thing, they go into the intensive care unit and they see dad and they're shocked because it's a completely different personality. It's not just the drugs, it's the emotional stress, it's all the things that are going on because this person is right there at the edge of death, and as far as the body knows, it's about to die because it doesn't know we have intensive care units. It just thinks that it's at the brink of existence, and people's personalities change. But with the drugs on top of that, like in anesthesia, there's one drug, Diprivan. They often call it mother's milk. It's the drug that killed Michael Jackson. They overdosed him, along with the opiates and things, I guess. It's a classic thing. If you know any anesthesiologists, ask them about it. People, when they wake up, it's like they took ecstasy. They're so happy. They're in love with everyone. I mean, like a drill sergeant from the Army at the VA hospital. And I put the guy to sleep to have his, TERP procedure or gallbladder taken out or whatever. And he comes out and he wants to give me a big hug. Wow, Dr. Aliffe, I really love you. You're just amazing. I'm so glad that you helped me. And this person is in that state. The same person who's barking out orders. You sit down, stand up, run around. That person, and no one who knows them has ever seen them that way. They haven't even seen themselves that way unless we shoot a video. That's how many other personalities and states of being are inside of this mind. And when you give people that much freedom of personality, forget gender fluidity. If you're talking about character fluidity, wow, that's a big deal for a society to deal with because mostly everybody expects us to be on the freeway on Monday morning driving north or south at a certain speed. And if suddenly we just take an exit and head to the beach, whoa, that changes everything. It's true. So this work of CBD and THC can work to put out the fire in the brain before it gets started, basically. The same sort of thing happens in its ability to control epileptic attacks, seizures. It's to be able to put out that fire because there's a bunch of information coming in on this poor little neuron, and it's just crazy. It's like 20 phones ringing at the same time, and it's all crank calls. And of course, the brain freaks out. But if you can kind of chill that out a little bit and just say, hey, whoever's calling, it's not that important. I'm just going to sit here and do my, yoga or something, and there's a huge change. Suddenly that person has the opportunity to live life at a more meaningful level. I would say like the rest of us, but I don't want to wish that on anyone. This self-regulatory mechanism is also at work in pain syndromes. So how much something hurts depends on what you've decided. And at that level of organization, you have the right to say, this doesn't hurt enough to keep me from running away from the tsunami. This doesn't hurt enough to tell her she's standing on my foot with her spike heels because this is our first date, and it's like, I know that'll be the end if I tell her we're dancing and she's standing on my foot. So it doesn't even hurt. You might not even notice it till 2 days later, and you wonder why it's hurting. You might never notice it at all. We think if somebody's standing on our foot, we'll know. But if we've given our brain permission to say, don't worry about it, there's something else more important going on, this might be the future Mrs. Somebody or Mr. Somebody, then all that stuff is offline. It's just done, okay? It's our body, and it's our right to decide what signals to answer, because pain is just a signal, and what signals to ignore. So this is just a final little piece here, and it looks at the therapeutic potential of non-psychotropic cannabidiol in ischemic stroke. And again, it mentions a lot of the activity potential of THC and CBD together, but also specifically cannabidiol on its own, and specifically mentioning the protection for the brain. So this is really well known. I might dramatize it a little bit, but this is clear, scientific, reproducible effect. The anti-inflammatory, anti-apoptotic, some people say it's apoptotic, but basically preventing these nerve cells from self-destroying. Cancer cells, it's fine. You want them to do that. So how do you have a molecule that knows that it's okay to toss this part? You know, it's kind of like an orange or something. You can throw away the peel, but keep the fruit. That's how wise this immune system is. It knows to target the cancer cells that are abnormal, and it knows to protect the brain cells, but we have to feed it. We have to keep the endocannabinoid tone up at a level where it can do this amazing job for us. And again, this article states once again here at the very bottom, on the other hand, CBD showed neuroprotective effect up to 6 hours after the cerebral ischemia, that they had blocked the blood flow to the brain of these mice. And the best drug, RTPA, recombinant tissue plasminogen activator is what that stands for, is the treatment of choice for acute stroke, but it only works within the short 3 hours after the onset of symptoms in clinical practice. So it shows that CBD works twice as well as this drug that sells and makes a lot of money for pharmaceutical companies. And that's just some stuff growing in somebody's backyard. So my interpretation of the data is that everybody who might get hit in the mouth or is repeatedly getting hit in the mouth needs to have a plan. Perhaps every contact sport athlete could benefit from the CNS, the central nervous system protection, with CBD treatments, as I mentioned, like an oil rub down, following significant impact. Because remember, you have up to 6 hours. I would suggest that everybody that's doing things like boxing and football, it should just be on a daily basis. Why not? You know, like I said, if it's not a rub down, it can be a tincture under the tongue. Children whose brains, nervous systems are still developing and that are participating in amateur sports activities that involve periodic impact or trauma should be on what I call a Charlotte's Web protocol, not just because Joel introduced me, but because of my picture in my mind of Charlotte Figge. Okay, she's way over here, right? Was having 200 seizures a day. And these guys figured out, discovered, were blessed to know how to be able to help her to actually be able to function and be the daughter of a very loving family of parents, okay? Just with this little simple treatment. Well, what's going on with the kids that already live over here that are kind of normal neurons, normal brains, but they're having this impact? They're headed in the other direction. Every time, every one of those little mild TBI events is pushing them in the direction of where Charlotte is fighting for her life to get away from. So if it's safe enough for this little girl who had been, as I understand it, given up for dead by the doctors, then that pretty much passes muster for me that kids, if there's some kid who's hell-bent on being the next, Heisman Trophy winning fullback or quarterback, it might be a good choice. It might be a sound choice. I'm not in a position to responsibly recommend it generically to all people with all their kids, but I would definitely recommend people give it consideration, considering the science. That all kids starting out in all of the contact sports, football, soccer, etc., should be adding a cannabinoid layer to their current protective gear, because 10 or 15 years of repeated head injury tends toward a TBI, seizure, or CTE future. So here's this thing, traumatic brain injury and epilepsy. If you look at the second line of the abstract, post-traumatic epilepsy accounts for 10 to 20% of epilepsy cases in the general population. So that's not me just extrapolating that, oh, if they're getting hit in the head, they're going to end up having seizures. 20% of actual epilepsy has its origin in people that maybe if they were taking CBD would not have progressed down that path of pathophysiology. So this is just a study that was done in Mexico that showed how well CBD-rich hemp oil worked for people. And this is an interesting point, and this is the last one. Topical application of THC-containing products. This study that was done in Germany, because someone claimed that he was under the influence of THC, but he hadn't been smoking. He had just been using some topicals, and obviously they must have been too strong. And so they decided to do a study to prove that he was wrong. And as far as they were concerned, they did so back in 2016, that the topical application of THC-containing products, like the topicals that are available in Washington State and anywhere else, are not able to cause a positive cannabinoid finding on a tox screen, a blood or a urine drug test, okay? So it's just a small study, but considering the small amounts of THC that are in hemp CBD oil, it's in that range, okay? And so this to me is a huge surface, in addition to being a market niche, as I mentioned, that this group, people that are of the hemp industry and care about people like the Stanley brothers caring about Charlotte Figge, that I think that character is within each of you, and it's a great problem that can be diverted. A lot of kids going on to adulthood can actually perhaps go in another direction rather than the CTE, the anxiety, the depression. It also even works with PTSD, you know. At all those schools, as tragic as it is, you know, shooter events and all that, kids coming in, as crazy as it may sound, and they want, oh, well, they should give guns to the teachers. They should give tinctures to the teachers. And when that stuff happens, I'm serious, you know, little oral mucosal spray. Everybody say, ah, psst, 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 psst. Hey, because the level of trauma that leads to PTSD is not not a functional adaptation. It's dysfunctional. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention and your interest and support. And again, with cannabinoids, that's CBD right there. We can think and heal different and change the world. Thank you.
Dr. Aliffe. Hey there. I just noticed that our follow-up speaker is actually not present, and I wanted to know if anyone in the audience had any questions, because I'd be happy to. Oh, wow. There's a lot of questions, hey?
Let all the air out of his tires. I wanted his time.
Yeah. Well, would you like to address some of their questions?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, wonderful. We'll start right here.
Do you anticipate that the NFL is going to finally come along to embrace CBDs? They've been a little slow on the curve relative to other professional sports leagues.
I'm very optimistic. When I watch the trajectory of change with respect to cannabis and legislation and regulation, to me what's happened so far is nothing short of phenomenal. And so, yes, because the science is there, it's very compelling, and you can continue to do further science and continue to study players without putting them at risk, because first, do no harm. It's a safe product. It's available for human consumption, and people that want to use it could be allowed to use it, and they could be compared in parallel with those that have chosen not to. You know, remember that the alternatives for these people, especially when it comes to pain and trauma, typically are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and then, of course, steroids, both classes of which have huge side effects, okay? And then the next step beyond that is opiates, and I'm sure you guys are up to here hearing about opiates and what opiates do. And humans really just are not designed to deal with a medicine cabinet that has a relatively unlimited supply of opiates sitting in there. It just doesn't work. The part of you that says, no, I shouldn't take twice as much as I was prescribed, the opiate says yes. And as you take one, it says take another. And as you take another, it says take more. That's just the way that system works. It's supposed to help you get away from the tiger that's chasing you. It's not supposed to be taken for 6 months or 6 years. It just means we're not really dealing with that pain well. So yes, if they can accept that their players test positive for opiates because of a prescription, and that's a dangerous drug that could lead to an overdose that is much more addictive than cannabinoids, whether it's high or low THC, where's the logic to say no? So if people are concerned about recreational use, well, it's the same as with opiates. If somebody takes a urine test, a spot check, and they show positive for THC, just like if they show positive for any of the opiates, fentanyl, for instance, and they don't have a prescription, you know that that's recreational use. That's pretty simple. So it's not any more difficult to manage than opiates. In a sense, it's much, much easier to manage.
Question. One of your slides up there, and I wrote it down, it's hemp seed oil is not the same as CBD or hemp oil. I was a little confused by that.
Yeah, so the seeds of hemp, just like the seeds of any plant, can produce an oil, okay? Just like, say, peanut oil can be produced from pressing those seeds. There are different constituents inside of a seed or a nut than there are inside of the plant. So the oil that's being referred to with respect to hemp and cannabis and any other botanical has to do with an extraction process. So it's like an essential oil, okay? And it's a very different set of constituents because it's taking all of these botanical molecules from the leaves and flowers and other parts of the plant that don't exist in the seed. And in a plant, the seeds have a very different function than the leaves and the flowers, so they have different chemistry.
I've got the mic. Brilliant talk, Dr. Aliffe. Over here.
Yeah, I want to see you because you're saying nice things.
Okay. You know how the body has opioid receptors and it produces endorphins and enkephalins that are natural opiates. Does the body produce cannabinoids because it's got the receptors, or does it need the external hemp plant to get the nutrient? Like it's a nutrient, basically, it sounds, that we actually need because we've got the receptors from an evolutionary point of view.
Yes, no, the body does produce endocannabinoids. They're referred to the molecules that are produced by the human body that have been shown to function at the different receptor sites in the endocannabinoid system. Anandamide is the main one that's talked about, and that name means bliss molecule, and it's very active at CB1, but it doesn't get people high. And THC is said to mimic the activity of anandamide, but somehow people think that THC does get people high. The pharmacology, the assumption doesn't make any sense. But yes, the body does produce these molecules. There are several other ones, PEA, which is palmitoyl ethanolamide, and it's very similar in structure to these other endocannabinoids, and more are being discovered all the time. Plus, there are lots of them in our daily diet. There are cannabinoids in black pepper. So this is part of the interaction between the human and the environment because it's in our diet, but it's also being produced inside of us. But just as a little geeky, nerdy, tip, human cells also produce morphine. I mean, real morphine, not like endorphin and enkephalin morphine. I mean like the regular drug morphine in very, very small amounts. But it's been detected that human cells produce morphine. So that means it's a natural, biological human compound. It's not just a botanical. There's just so much going on inside of here that as we refine our ability to see deeper and deeper inside of the body and of the brain and into molecular level and beyond, there are things that we're discovering about ourselves that we would never have imagined.
So when we're injured, we basically just need a little more of the CBD and cannabidiol diols, right?
Yep, my way of looking at it is really, I think of it in a nutritional sense. And I know nutrition means a lot of different things to different people, but when I think of nutrition, I think of beneficial molecules, components like vitamins that have a profound effect on the body, but they need to continually be consumed. And so say like vitamin C, and granted there are some people that are into megadose vitamin C, but to run the body at a normal, functional, healthy level, there's a certain amount of vitamin C that each of us requires, and normally we're able to get that from our diet. When we don't get that from our diet, then there's a disease called scurvy that sailors used to get, which is deadly. It's like, it kills you way faster than cancer. It's just a few weeks. So it's an essential nutrient, and it just takes time for the social forces within science and medicine to be able to accept something like that and to be able to state it. I mean, it took over 100 years for vitamins like vitamin C to be accepted as such. And that's what the name means, actually. Vitamin means vital amine, that life itself, it's vital to life. So these cannabinoids may very well be vital to human life. We may have been denying ourselves the best source available that's growing all around us, all around the world, because of political reasons. But it's in other plants, it's in other substances as well. So yes, given this though, to keep in mind, each person is different from everyone else, regardless of the categories we might be able to put someone into. So what one person's endocannabinoid system may benefit from to have optimal endocannabinoid tone, let's say optimal cannabinoid nutrition, they may require this much, they may require a ratio between CBD, THC, CBG, CBN, all of those, that's very different from another person. But then on top of that, so, you know, think of like identical twins, and one, you know, is a senior master vintner up in Napa Valley who just basically makes wine and tastes wine all day, and every day at 5:30 or 6 p.m. goes out in Marin County and watches the sunset with his or her family and has a little wine. But he, let's say, has a twin brother who's a stockbroker in New York, and every day around that same time is in traffic trying to get home because he missed his son's soccer game and that sort of thing, okay? They don't have the same requirement. And I can say that because I know from anesthesia that depending on the state that a person is, regardless of what their genetics are, people have a different requirement and they also have a different response. So it might seem like, oh, it's more difficult to put this person to sleep when they're stressed. Sometimes it's easier. All you have to do is just say, go to sleep, boom, because their body needs to sleep so much. And then it's hard to wake them up, okay? So the conditions of the person vary, and as those conditions vary, the state of this nervous system, of this endocannabinoid system vary. But doesn't that make sense? Because like I said, you know, one day a person might be on an island of Indonesia living in this relatively idyllic paradise, working in a rice paddy, and, you know, life is good. They're not rich, they're not poor, they've got food for their family, and, you know, their environment, their community supports them. And then there's a huge earthquake. And following that earthquake, there's a tsunami, and suddenly life is very different. For an organism, an animal like we are, to survive, you can't have, you know, a pastoral program running in the condition of an emergency. You have to be able to manage all of that stuff. So the challenge that we have is that many of us run little spikes of tsunami stress throughout our pastoral, suburban, you know, mechanical, computer-supported lives. A little bit late for work, driving a little bit too fast, zoom, here comes a cop with the lights on. You know, out there in the wild, out there in the rainforest where I used to do some work, that stress would be maybe a rare encounter with a predatory animal. You either make it or you don't. It's not there every morning. It's not waiting for you when you get to work going like that. It's like, oh my God, if I lose my job, I won't be able to. So we have this unusual sort of lifestyle where the stresses are very complex. And depending on how a person responds to those stresses, the system that's responsible to reduce the amount of harm that stress does to us, and remember, the emotional pain and the physical pain to the brain are the same, okay? So somebody who got shot, in the line of duty, like in Pittsburgh, the police officers that were trying to help the people in that synagogue, that pain, and somebody who's really embarrassed because, they didn't get the job that they thought they would get, okay? That nervous system is running at the same. And so to support ourselves through the way that we live, this system is exactly what we need, apparently. To support it is exactly what we need to be doing.
Thank you, Dr. Aliffe. I just wanted to make an announcement. We only have time for one more question, and this gentleman has been standing since we asked to start the question, so I want to make sure you have that opportunity, of course. I do also want to announce that the Vape Lounge will be open until 7 p.m. If you're interested in that, there's a cash bar up there with a signature cocktail and an infusion station for CBD, so go relieve your stress. And that'll be going on until 7 p.m. It's in the Malibu Garden on the 3rd floor, and you will see the signs and have some enjoyment up there, and we'll follow up with your question.
Thank you. And so the endocannabinoid system is producing CBDs naturally. That's correct?
It's producing molecules that work along with CBD. It's not actually apparently producing that actual molecule, but it's working along with it. And a way to think of that is, say, in our diet, like if you eat an apple, there's sugar in that apple, but the kind of sugar that's in that apple is not the same sort of sugar that's running through your blood and going to the brain. But as I mentioned in the earlier talk, the liver has that ability, the body has that ability to transform this molecule into what it needs, or to utilize that as a signal in order to trigger other parts. So the CBD is interacting with this system, and it's interacting in a very unusual way, which is why, like I said, the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmacologists are very confounded, because it's not linear. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2 linear. It does all of these things. In some papers, they've even referred to CBD as a promiscuous molecule, because it runs around the body and it does all sorts of things. It goes to the neighbor's house and waters the garden, and it cuts the other neighbor's hair, and it teaches the neighbor's kids how to do algebra. I mean, it's doing all these community services within the body, and it's like, well, you shouldn't just be doing one thing? That's what our drugs do. So that's kind of an illustration that the cannabinoids, the phytocannabinoids, plant cannabinoids from cannabis and other plants, support that system, especially because often we're stressing that system and either taking it down and making it weaker, or overdriving it, overtaxing it. So it works in support of that part of the body. So here's another challenge that we face with our cultural approach to things, because even though we celebrate being free people, we're always looking for a program. We're always looking for somebody to tell us what to do, and to take 3 of these 5 times daily for the next 6 weeks and then continue. It's more dynamic than that. Think of coffee. Maybe there's some people that have 4 cups of coffee every day at 8 a.m., 10 a.m., 4 p.m., and 6 p.m. or something. But I think most people microdose their coffee. They microdose their caffeine. They drink however much they feel that they need, and they know their body, and they know their drug, their coffee, well enough to be able to manage that. If people can manage coffee, they can manage hemp, okay? And so that, and like I mentioned earlier, coffee is psychotropic. So it's a matter of caring enough about yourself to recognize what you need and when, because you might need a little extra CBD, 3 weeks from now for Thanksgiving, when you go with your partner, to visit the in-laws or whatever for Thanksgiving, and Uncle Charlie's there drinking bourbon as usual, and you might really want to see how far you can push that CBD, okay? So that's the way we live. But the great thing is, it's a very safe product, natural product that can help us get through some of these typhoons and tsunamis that we run into that we call daily life.